When we look at M&E as kind of a capsule terminology, both of them have one key factor in them, and that's learning. And we don't spend enough time with learning. The rocket scientists say that they love to have rocket successes, but when they have a rocket failure, they see this as a wonderful opportunity to pull things apart, to see where things failed. And so if we have in place an evaluation process that specifically looks at what didn't work, and that we have enough time windows to say what failed, why did it fail, what was the kind of physiology behind this kind of failure, and furthermore, what can we learn from this, given this particular context, that we can use to inform our programming for the future. If we have an opportunity to say, what have we learned from this? What have we learned from our failures? And what are the opportunities to do better the next time? Then I think the M&E program has been very successful. I'm Gilbert Burnham, and I'm professor of public health in the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health in Baltimore in the Department of International Health. And within that, we are in the Center for Humanitarian Health, which looks at many of the public health issues that are faced for humanitarian crises, humanitarian emergencies. The monitoring and evaluation person, I think, is in a wonderful position. On one hand, you can be connected with the field. You can understand what the people need. At the same time, you can be connected with leadership, what the leadership wants to have out of this, what they're faced with, what are their challenges. And there are not many other situations where people at a kind of information level or a technical level in the center can bridge both sides. So this is an exciting position, I think, to be in. If we're thinking about leadership, then how does M&E fit with the attributes, the perceptions, the skills, the competencies of leaders? It's important for leaders to understand what they need to know. Not what's nice to know, what's convenient to know, what they wanted to know in their last job, but what do they need to know in this situation? And this again comes to the question of what decisions do they need to make? And furthermore, what are the risks in this population for something serious to happen? If he or she is going to reduce the risks for this population, what kind of information do you need to know that will inform programming? So first is a realization of what you need to know. And then secondly, it's a realization of what kind of resources, what kind of personnel, what kind of training and so forth are going to be able to provide you with the information that you want. The question comes up about, are we monitoring the right thing? Are we monitoring things that are relevant to the situation that we're dealing with at the moment? Historically, many of our programs are built on our experiences with the African peasant migrant or displaced person or refugee from the times of the wars of independence in Africa and then chaos that was present in many countries afterwards. So many of our standards are built on that. Now we're dealing in a different world. We're dealing with middle income countries. We're dealing with quite educated people not with necessarily with malaria, but now with type 2 diabetes or hypertension. And in many ways, we're kind of stuck with some of the traditions that we built from our experiences in earlier times dealing with the agricultural peasant going across the border and building a mud dwelling on the other side of the border. So we're having to do a lot of shifting. What are some alternative approaches? We need to have data. We're already convinced, because we have good monitoring people, we have good leadership, we're convinced that we need to have data. And so that is a given. How do we find these data? A classic problem is in the measurement of mortality. So how do we measure deaths during an acute emergency? We may not be able to measure illnesses people have. We may not be able to measure recovery time or maybe bacterial sensitivity to particular antibiotics, but we want to know deaths, because deaths help us to decide, is this an acute emergency, or are we in the level where this is within the mortality rates of a population already? And many decisions hinge upon whether we're in this acute emergency situation. Every emergency at some point will have some form of community health workers, community agents that are functioning in that population, because often the actual implementing organization doesn't have that connection with the community that these community health workers would have. They are eyes and ears. They can tell you what people are saying, what's going on in the community, and they are also the best source of numbers. Are there lots of people coming? Are there lots of people leaving? Who's the vulnerable population? Where are they going? And so forth. So there's a lot of kind of traditional sources of information. So making your connection as the leader, as the organization, with whatever traditional authorities are present in this community. And whenever communities are displaced, there are always people that quickly develop as leaders, that quickly develop as some kind of organizational system. Now, sometimes they're pretty unsavory people. They may be the genocidaires and so forth, but as a public health person, you have to work with whatever kind of materials you have on hand. So establishing these kind of communications. Now, this will not give you information always that's good to 2 or 3 decimal points, but in emergency situations, much of your information is achieved by triangulation between various sources of information. So having multiple sources of information and figuring that someplace in between all of this, we've got the true data. There are a lot of outliers. What can we disregard, which are really important things. So looking at existing information, looking at qualitative information from traditional leaders, from mothers groups, from community health workers, all of those can help you. So we're thinking about some alternatives to the traditional evaluation. And I might say for many people, the traditional evaluation is a group of external experts who come in, they spend some time going through the records, they produce a result and a nice report. The report, of course, usually arrives about 3 months after the project has been closed. It goes onto the shelf someplace, and in the checklist, that little box is ticked off because the evaluation has been done. Okay, that really doesn't help much of anything. So what we're looking at now are evaluations that are done frequently, evaluations that can be done as programs are being put into place, the formative evaluations, but even beyond that, something that has a quick turnaround to the results to advise both the stakeholders as well as the implementers. Now we need to change directions 45 degrees or 180 degrees or something that context has changed. We tend to monitor what's actually happening in the situation rather than the context around us. So developing some good indicators that measure context and understanding how those contexts drive implementation, I think, is an area that we need to do a lot more. Then we're looking at trying to figure out how have these, to evaluate how these programs have actually affected the beneficiaries. Tends to be that many of our evaluation questions are, you got so many metric tons of food, you got equipment to provide so much water or so much space per population. What now have you actually done? Did you actually satisfy those objectives that you wrote 6 months ago or a year ago when you wrote the program? But we need to look at the beneficiaries themselves. How have we changed the lifestyles? How have we changed the perceptions? How have we changed senses of security, the protection issues of this population? Putting into place programs that are resource intensive, whether human resources or financial resource intensive, and putting into place things that are not compatible with the local health systems, I think creates a lot of issues. Now, we're very much talking these days about the disaster development nexus. And if you've been in humanitarian issues for a long time, this thing has been around by various names for a long time. And now we're talking with a new name and with new hopes that maybe we'll have some new clever ideas that we didn't have before. But looking at how do programs in place, how are they compatible with existing cultural identities, existing ways of doing things, existing health systems? And one of the problems that many responders have is they don't really appreciate the health system. They have a system or an approach that they know is better than what is being done locally. And they're probably right. But when they leave, what's going to be enduring? What this new fancy, shiny program they put into place that's clearly, best in the solar system, or business as usual. So understanding business as usual and being willing to compromise, I think, is really important. And one of the things I learned from many years of working in rural Africa is there's only one thing harder than starting something new, and that's stopping something old. And so realizing that there's an inertia from the traditional ways of doing things, the traditional ways of thinking about diseases is really important. And understanding those things, I think, is something we don't often take enough time to do. A substantial amount of resources usually go into the monitoring and evaluation program. And many times managers may see these resources as a go down, as a resource to say, okay, we have this, now I have an emergency, I want to take money out of that to do this, and now I have these capable people with their MPH training from whatever famous university, and but now I need to have somebody that will do training in this area or will help us with field work here. So these monitoring and evaluation resources need to be protected. And a good manager who understands the importance will protect these resources to be sure that these resources are producing the information that they need that can help them turn around their program fairly quickly if these unintended consequences start showing up. This is really, to my mind, the premise of why we as academics are doing all of this stuff, is that we're trying to create a cadre of personnel that understand why we're collecting data, understand the consequences of good decisions and bad decisions, and can help inform the decision-making process. Never mind what it says on page 27 about the information we should collect in the acute emergency phase. What do we need to do in this context right now? And I think this also points out one of our deficits in public health. We tend to focus on micronutrients, we tend to focus on numbers of liters of water per person per day, and we don't have enough understanding of the political context, of the conflict context that we're working in, because these are the things that really drive the conditions we're trying to deal with. And I think, unlike clinicians who are looking at an individual patient, want to see what can be done to cure this patient, get this patient returned to normality, many times we're dealing with consequences, we're dealing with health issues over which we have no control. But we need to understand the political contexts that are driving these to see what our windows are for opportunities, what the humanitarian space is where we can be effective, and at the same time, again, the academic line here is if we have looked at these things, done careful analysis of this, then we have an idea about the general kind of things that work and the general things that don't work. And coming back to the sphere standards are always being updated. We have another set in the works at the moment. If we look at many of these sphere standards, these represent what a lot of wise people have decided sitting around a table someplace, or maybe on Skype. There's not a lot of empirical data that tells us, given this context, we should be doing this, we should be doing that. So one of the academic kind of goals that I think we have is how do we back up some of these standards with really solid evidence? There are a lot of new horizons out there that we need to use very strict, very robust, very strong evaluation and monitoring programs to answer. And these can be done even in the emergency situations. Maybe they're not so sophisticated, maybe they're not so complex, maybe we can't do the same level of analysis that we could in a controlled trial or some other type of assessment approach, but there are things that can be done at every stage in the humanitarian emergency that collects the data and that gives us things that we can learn from.